So this is just a very quick rundown on political events in this country. So some of you might remember in Quebec, we had a commission that went around the province trying to find out what people thought about this idea in 2012, started 2010. And actually about 2/3 of people said that they were not in favor of euthanasia. And so then the committee recommended in favor of it, and then the law came into effect. So that was in 2014, the law. Then there was a case before the Supreme Court that said that it was unconstitutional to deny people the right to kill themselves or to have a doctor kill them. And that led to the 2016 law, which is when those statistics started for Canada, that said that if natural death was reasonably foreseeable, in other words, somebody was close to the end of their life, it was legal for a doctor to end their life. And that had already been legal in Quebec for a year. We're always ahead of everybody else. Then there was a court case with two people with severe disabilities who said, well, if the people who are dying can get it, why can't we get it? And so that actually, they won their case. It was at the first level of the court in Quebec. And that overturned both the Quebec and the federal laws. Some of you probably know that normally if a lower level court overturns a law, the government, challenges the decision, and it goes to the next level, and then it goes to the Supreme Court. They appeal it. Sorry, I couldn't remember the word. And but neither Quebec nor Canada appealed it, so that became the law. So that was when, in 2021, the Canadian law changed to say you don't have to be dying. You could just have severe suffering from an illness and want to die. And so that's been the law now since March 2021. That anybody who has a serious illness in an advanced state of decline and is suffering can ask for their life to be ended by their doctor, and it's legal for the doctor to do it. So that's kind of scary. Then they keep on having commissions about this because there's always people pushing for more and more expansion. So there was one in Quebec, there was one on the federal level. So this is just to give you an idea of, sorry, yeah, the next one. Sorry, I keep forgetting that when I change my slide, it doesn't change his slide. So when the first Canadian law came in, there were a number of safeguards, right? So this is to reassure the population saying, no, 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 this is very serious. We put lots of limits to make sure that it's not just anybody. So for example, you need to have 2 doctors assess the patient, 2 people witness that the patient really wanted it. The patient had to be competent to decide. They had to wait for 10 days. You had to make sure that they understood. And then there were the eligibility criteria. So this was all there. And then what happens after, and it keeps on happening, is that then people, like the people in the lawsuit, said, yeah, but these are like obstacles to getting my rights. So instead of being safeguards to protect people, they're turned on their head and become obstacles to getting rights. So that's what led to the 2021 law. And so next slide. Basically, almost all of those safeguards have been removed. So the doctors don't have to be independent of each other. So somebody could get his resident to confirm. The witnesses don't have to be independent. Somebody can now say, if I ask for it now, but if I lose decision-making capacity before the time comes, you can still do it. So you can euthanize a person who's not competent to choose it at that moment. They eliminated the waiting time. They have to inform people, but the alternatives don't necessarily have to be available. So you can say, well, yes, you have the right to palliative care and all of these things, but unfortunately we don't have them in our hospital. But we do have medical aid in dying. So anyway, I'm sure you understand. And death does not have to be foreseeable. So it can be at any time in life if you're suffering, no matter how old or young you are. So the next one. So who qualifies for MAID under this law is basically anybody with a chronic illness, a disability, a mental illness, blindness, deafness, accidents. This picture is a friend of mine who has been paraplegic since an accident in his 20s. And is a very serious advocate against medical aid in dying because he feels like he and people like him are targeted by this law, which they are. Next slide. So before the law passed, politicians, to reassure us, were saying, oh, this will be very rare. We'll have maybe 100 people. It's all about promoting palliative care. And these are the numbers that you heard just a minute ago. So in 2022, almost 5,000 deaths in Quebec. 46% increase from the year before. and in Canada, 13,000, 30% increase from the year before. So it's going up at a very steep rate. This is, next slide, please. This is one of the early cases. It was in the papers in Montreal. Some of you might remember Archie Roland. So he was in the Montreal Chest Hospital on a ventilator permanently because he had a neurologic disease that prevented him from breathing on his own. And he was happy. I mean, it was kind of a very limited life, but he had no desire to die. And then with the reorganization of the English hospitals, he was transferred to somewhere else where there was other staff that were not familiar with his needs, who didn't understand. And when he pushed the call bell, they did not necessarily answer him, even if he felt like he was choking, and he did not feel safe in that new environment. So he basically left without leave and found a doctor who would euthanize him, and he died. It was basically because he could not get the care that he needed. And this was all perfectly legal, and it was in the Gazette before and after. This next case is Roger Foley. Is a man in Ontario who had a neurological disease. He needed help to live independently at home. The home care workers that the government provided gave him wrong medications, gave him spoiled food, made all kinds of terrible mistakes, and he landed in hospital numerous times. And the last time he landed in hospital, he said, I want to have self-directed home care where I hire the people and I supervise them because his mind is fine. And the government said no, or the health authority said no. And then they said, well, if you keep on staying in the hospital, we'll charge you $1,500 a day. And by the way, you could have medical aid in dying. So they didn't realize who they were dealing with. So he actually tape recorded the conversation and sued the government and the hospital. But the bad news is that he's still in the hospital 5 years later because it hasn't been resolved. But again, he could have been eligible. He didn't want it, but it was the only thing that was offered to him. Next slide, please. Whoop. So does this come up? So there was a show on, it's okay, it doesn't matter. I know what it says. Yeah. There was a show on the Fifth Estate in last winter. So even CBC was getting alarmed about the medical aid in dying law. And so some of these cases, the last two were, so Sophia was a woman who had multiple chemical sensitivities. It's something that there's no consensus about in medicine, whether it's a physical disease, whether it's a mental disease. In any case, she could not find an apartment that she could afford that did not have all kinds of toxic substances coming out of the ventilation system, and it made her feel sick. And so she requested medical assistance in dying on that basis, and she died. She was 51. The other, Mr. Farsood, was a man who was disabled and couldn't work, and he was going to be evicted from his apartment because the building had been sold, and he could not find an apartment that he could afford. He was afraid of becoming homeless, and so he applied for medical assistance in dying on the basis of a disability, and he was approved. He did not die because somehow it got into the news, and a person he did not know started a GoFundMe page to collect money for him. And once he had enough money to pay the rent, he didn't want to die anymore. So it was not a medical cause, it was a social cause. And the last one was a young man with diabetes who had just lost his vision and was approved over the phone. This was in Toronto for medical assistance in dying. And then his family found out and started a phone call campaign, a letter campaigning to the doctor, and the doctor got scared and backed off. But he would have been euthanized for diabetes and new blindness that he had not yet got accustomed to and learned to live with. So this is what's happening in our country legally right now. So these are just the next slide, please. So I won't go through all of this, but you might have heard about the Veterans Affairs offering medical aid in dying to some of the veterans when they were looking for other things. Committees where people resigned because they felt it was so biased. Simon's store made a video glorifying medical aid in dying. And it turned out that the woman who died, who it was about, had several months before done an interview with CTV where she had a rare medical illness and could not get treatment for it. And she was looking for treatment. She was not looking for death, but she couldn't get it. So she ended up dying by MAID. And Simon's, maybe they didn't know the backstory, or maybe they did. It was as if there was this glorious autonomous decision of this woman to choose death. And it was really about not getting good health care. Next slide, please. So it's speeding up this year. So the federal government had a committee and they recommended MAID for what they call mature minors, which is teenagers who they consider able to consent, for mental illness, which is already programmed to become law in March, and by advance request in case of incapacity. So those are my patients, people who are losing cognition, and they will be able to sign a paper when they're diagnosed, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, to say when I get to say I can't recognize my children anymore, I want the doctor to end my life. There was a bill passed in Quebec in June that actually legalized MAID by advance request, except that they have to wait until the federal government lets them. So that's why it says within 2 years. Any disability, which is already the case in the rest of Canada, and that forces all palliative care homes to provide MAID by December, so in 1 month. And so this is what we're living with. So the question of MAID for mental illness, which is coming, the government, was supposed to be last year, they delayed it to next March. It's not going to make any difference because the system's not ready to take care of all of these people, give them the proper mental health care, but it's going to come. So they will get MAID more easily than they get mental health care. There was a Conservative member of Parliament who tabled a private member's bill. Hi, David. To cancel the implementation of MAID for mental illness. It was defeated by a very, very narrow margin just a couple of weeks ago. And as you may know, private members' bills usually don't pass, but this one was so close because there are actually a lot of people who are worried about what's happening. So even members of the government voted in favor, but it didn't pass. Next slide, please. So the government committee, I was a witness to the federal government committee, it's called MAID. And basically what we saw happening was that they selectively listened to the witnesses that they wanted to hear, which were the ones that were in favor of MAID, and they did not listen to the witnesses. And they were actually very rude to some of the witnesses who were promoting caution, let's say, about medical aid in dying. And so there was a counter report that this is just a glimpse of for each of these 5 issues that were covered in the federal government report. So another big issue, the next slide please, is freedom of conscience. So can a doctor or another health professional who thinks this is wrong and it's not part of their vocation as a physician, can they not be involved? Well, yes and no. So Ontario, which is, it's actually very explicit that if you're a doctor and a patient asks for medical aid in dying and you feel that it's not right, you have to make sure that they go to another doctor who's going to give it to them. So basically you're part of the chain that's going to lead to them having their life ended. So I don't think that's right either. In Quebec, it's a little bit more fuzzy. Basically, you just have to notify the administrator an administrator in your hospital and they will find someone. So how much that involves you, it depends a little bit on how the hospital runs, but it's not, you can't stand up and say, this is wrong, I can't do it, and stop there. You have to make sure that something happens. Next slide, please. So this is an article that came out in the UK, Why is Canada Euthanizing the Poor? So some of those cases I just told you about, people that couldn't get an affordable apartment and things like that. Everybody can find a medical diagnosis that would justify the request, almost everybody. So it's basically MAID driven by poverty. Next one, about disability. Catherine Frazee is an amazing woman who was born paralyzed except for one finger, I think. She became an emeritus professor of disability studies at Ryerson University, brilliant woman. And so this was a speech that she gave in one of the parliamentary committees saying, like, why do you target us for death when other marginalized people are not targeted for death? When we prevent suicide for other people, you're promoting it for us. That's basically what she was saying, very powerful. But the government ignored her. Next slide, please. This is from the UN. So the UN has a position called the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And they looked at the Canadian law and said it's discriminatory against people with disabilities because it targets them for death more than other people. Next slide, please. This is another one about Indigenous people. So there was a letter to the government by many Indigenous leaders saying this is against our values, it's against our beliefs, and we do not think this should be forced on our people. So just some key points out of that, and then I'll pass it back to my friends here. So this is an act that directly ends somebody's life. It's promoted as medical treatment. Instead of preventing suicide, we're promoting it, we're providing it. Often people have the idea that, and certainly when the law first came into effect, the idea most people had was, you have 3 days left to live, you've got unbearable pain, it can't be controlled, so we have to put you out of your misery. There are very few cases like that because palliative care is really good now if you can get it. But as you can see, it's already gone way, 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 way past that. So the idea that radical personal autonomy, it's my life, it belongs to me, it's my property, I can eliminate it if I want to. That's what's promoting this. I think the governments are in a conflict of interest because they save money every time somebody dies by MAID. Once you take away that line that nobody can ever take anybody else's life, there's no way of putting another line because the other lines don't hold up, and that's what's already happened, and it's continuing to happen. We need safe places where people to go. Every hospital is required to provide medical aid in dying in Quebec and the rest of Canada, except for some religious hospitals in other provinces. So we have to look after people instead of facilitating their death. So I'll stop there for the moment and proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm out of my depth even asking questions, but it's going to give you a break, and we'll let Dr. Nemeth speak about the ER, which is where where his strength is. But I was just thinking, because you just mentioned that at the end, it sounds like the issue is care. How much? Which one is cheaper, taking care of someone or opting for MAID? I think it's an obvious question, right? 50 years ago, if someone had diabetes, what were the chances that they would survive?
Well,
Or is 50 years enough?
well, insulin wasn't very well developed 50 years ago. People probably would have died a lot younger than, but certainly not at 23, Yeah. Yeah.
But my point is that as we push forward, in caring for people and learning, to care for people, that people tend to live longer. And the issue here is that people just stop doing research. They stopped pushing, am I properly understanding? Yeah.
I have a big enough mouth, so I'll
No, but it's recorded.
Oh, it's recorded. Well, first of all, credit to all of you for being here. This is like not a Friday night type of end of week topic, right? Like this is a heavy topic. So first of all, credit to all of you. Second thing is, before I weigh in, I want to thank Dr. Ferry. You guys don't know how blessed we are to have like nationally renowned expert, not just from a Christian point of view, but just from an ethical point of view and just the know-how that she brings here. So we're very blessed to have her. Also, two disclosures. One, I'm not an expert in this. I'm just here as a tag along, offering my perspective on what I see happening many times in the emergency department, where people do not make decisions before things get really bad, and they come into the emergency department in extremis, which means I'm very sick, and that's where decisions are pushed on them. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in length. And the other disclosure is, I'm sure I speak on behalf of Dr. Ferry as well. It's so easy for us to talk, sitting here, no pain. Some of us, I mean, I'm talking about myself now. I have absolutely no health related issues. So it's so easy for me to say, this is what it should be. This is what it should. I just want to make sure that you understand that I'm very sensitive to the fact that when you're suffering every day, it's probably a different decision. Doesn't mean it's right, but it's a different decision. So I just want to make sure you understand that I'm not, well, Joe, it's easy for you to talk because you're healthy and you're not in pain. I understand. And believe me, I see this every day. So with that saying, Paul, your question was I think I know where you were going with this. So as the medical knowledge pushes the boundaries and even more exactly, the diabetes is a perfect example. But you can go coronary artery disease, like cardiovascular disease. You can go into many of the cancers, like certain acute leukemias in pediatrics are like 90% not treatable but curable. And this is rare, this is like within the past, 10 years or so, maybe 20 years. So in 50 years ago, kids, were diagnosed with certain forms of acute leukemia, would have been given, and I don't want to use this word, but I'm going to the death sentence. Now they're curable. And I think I can apply some of the cancers the same way, right? Another one that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking at my wife right now, and I think she knows where I'm going, is cystic fibrosis. Her brother died at the age of 12 in the 70s, early 80s. I see people with cystic fibrosis living till 50, 60. Okay? So that's another incredible example of how things change. And then the other aspect of this, Paul, Pastor Paul, is that not only is the curative or the treatable things that are progressing, but I think Dr. Ferrier could speak to this, is the armamentarium or the treatment strategy we have for palliation. We have incredible type of medication, type of combination where we can ease the person's not just pain, but anxiety. Anxiety is a huge component of dying. I've seen many, and anxiety, I would say, is even a more difficult and more important thing to treat. And Dr. Ferrier can probably attest to this than the pain itself. So we have now evidence and treatment modalities that can help this and palliate this. So that's my one-liner.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Maybe you wanted to add something about.
The statistics say that about 30% of people who need palliative care in Canada have access to it. So if you have a connection with the big teaching hospitals, no problem, you'll get it. If you live outside a big city or whatever, and this is a big country, right? So a lot of people don't get the palliative care they need, and that's a big problem here. And it's true, the palliative care, that's not my field, I do geriatrics, but it can do unbelievable things to make people feel not only pain-free, but more relaxed and happy, and to have a really good end of life. And whether it's in a hospital or at home, it's you may know that Montreal was the starting place for palliative care in the whole of North America about 50 years ago, and it's a credit to us that it's so great, but it's still nowhere near. At the MUHC, they closed the unit at the beginning of COVID, and they just reopened it 2 months ago. So that's how important it is to our bureaucrats, palliative care, and they only have 12 beds.
Yeah. Did you want to say anything else concerning end-of-life issues in your ER perspective, or?
Before I do, we've been throwing around palliative care rather easily. Maybe some people do not understand the term. If you do, I apologize. But for those that do not, palliative care means a branch or discipline of medicine that deals with treating the symptoms of, frankly, dying, whether that be pain or anxiety or what have you. So that's palliative care. So like I said, Pastor Paul, we see, it's going to sound dramatic, we see death often in the emergency department for sure. And what we encounter in this realm of end-of-life questions and end-of-life decisions is the classic is the patient comes in with no advance directive, and I think we'll have a slide on that. The advance, okay, and we'll talk about this a little bit later of whether it's been a long drawn out chronic illness, and their primary care physician did not feel the need to speak to that patient about what would happen if you got really sick. Would you like for us, or for the people in the hospital, to go full court press? What I mean by that is, very aggressive treatment. And if your heart were to stop, would you want, CPR to be done? And CPR, for those of you who haven't witnessed, is very aggressive. It can involve breaking ribs, the breastbone, very painful procedure to try to restart the heart, on top of other procedures that you would do. Would you like that with very little chance of coming back? Or would you want to have palliation? I'm simplifying it, but this is this discussion that should be had by people with very severe chronic illness. However, sometimes people do not have this chronic illness, and they present with an acute, very severe, significant illness that might be terminal. And that's another discussion that we need to have in the emergency department. So I think it's very important that we all, and you can argue, Joe, this is really morbid. I agree, in some ways it is, but I think those of us that are middle-aged and older, we should start thinking and talking to our loved ones about this. And so we're sort of clear on just how aggressive the hospital or the healthcare system should be with our care if we were to present to the hospital in a very serious status.
Right. Yeah.
One of the problems is that everybody's afraid of talking about death, including doctors, right? And so that's why all these doctors, even though they know that their patient maybe, is going down, and might die next year, they're nervous about talking to the patient about it, so they don't. And then they end up in the emergency room and nobody has talked to them about it. And that's scandalous. And there's a palliative care doctor called Catherine Mannix, who she stopped doing clinical work, and now she gives talks and writes books about helping people understand dying. She was in Montreal just a few weeks ago. She spoke at the Jewish General, and in one of her videos, she says, when a doctor says, I'm going to refer you to respirology, they say, well, to help with your lungs, or or to GI, whatever, they just say, I'm going to refer you, and it's not a big deal, right? But when they want to refer to palliative care, they say, well, maybe it's not time, but maybe you don't want it, but, and they kind of go around in circles, because referring to palliative care means that you might die one day, right? And we all know that we're going to die one day, but nobody wants to talk about it. And that's a big part of the problem. And so often people don't get referred to palliative care when they could benefit from it long time before they're ready to die. They can help them, but they don't get referred because everybody's afraid of talking about dying.
So the last, I guess, is, from a Christian perspective, and thought I would give a little introduction about that. So beneath the really thin veneer of compassion and respect for a person, and despite the sincere intentions of those involved, and I don't doubt that all doctors are sincere in what they're doing, MAID constitutes a profound violation of human dignity and value, and it is an affront to the high status granted to us by our Creator, by God. It's easy to forget this when our culture seems to be pushing this all over the place. And so we need to remind ourselves of the true nature and depth of human value. And so there are many ways to talk about that. First, we have to remind ourselves of the distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic human value. Extrinsic value derives from what you can do. If you can do something, right? How intelligent you are, what talents you have, etc., etc. Whereas intrinsic value derives simply from who you are. Extrinsic value depends on your usefulness, whereas intrinsic value is unconditional. So sometimes we have difficulty understanding what that is, and yet we can apply it to things. things that we buy or sell, they can have these two things, can have extrinsic value, or like money, I guess. And there's things that have intrinsic value. Some of the things in your house, maybe, that are priceless. You wouldn't be able to put a price on it. I'm not sure that my Jeep has intrinsic value, or maybe it does. Maybe that's the reason why I bought the Jeep, right? You have a Jeep too, so there is some intrinsic value, but mostly it's just right. But I mean, there are things, you understand that about things, that things can have an intrinsic value. Well, there's the same thing for a human being. So if we're talking about the Christian perspective on the value of a human being, we have to look at what Scripture says. So Genesis chapter 1, we're created in the image of God. And after being created, God said it was very good. So God said that something was very good that he had created. Psalm 8, and I'm just picking and choosing. There's many scriptures, and I don't want to spend a whole night on this, but Psalm 8 says, you have made them a little lower, speaking of human beings, you have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. Luke chapter 12 says, indeed, the very hairs on your head are all numbered. I know we can number hair now, but the point is that every detail of us God knows about. Don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows, Jesus says. In other words, you have worth, you are important. Philippians chapter 3 says that God will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body. Jesus healed people even though those people, we think of some of the people like Lazarus, he raised from the dead, even though Lazarus died a little bit later, but he did that to bring glory to himself, right? So there was value in the body, right? 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and here's an interesting one. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So even our suffering has purpose, God says. And there's so many scriptures that we could read that bear this out, that even our suffering has purpose and brings us closer to God. And so these, the Bible says, are important as well. I found this author. Her name is Catherine Butler. She is a trauma critical care surgeon. Not Canadian, she's from the Boston area, but she wrote a book on this subject, and this is what she says. This is, when we ignore God's work in suffering and cleave breathlessly only to our hope for a cure, we forsake opportunities for closure, fellowship, and spiritual preparation at the end of life. If we set our eyes only on a cure rather than on the reality of our physical mortality, we may chase after treatments that not only fail to save us, but which also rob us of our capacities to think, communicate, and pray in our final days. And if cure does not come, a single-minded focus on healing strands ourselves and those we love with unsettling doubts about the validity of our faith. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this on Sunday, because I'm talking about when God doesn't heal, and how do we pray in those instances? How do we approach God? And we can and should approach God in those situations. In fact, it is in those situations that most people find themselves turning to God. Is that all worthless? Right? So Um, we are created in God's image and we have value to Him. We should look at other people and see the image of God. I think so often of um, La Mère Thérèse, Mother Teresa, that would spend years and years and years in Calcutta. And people would often ask her, why do you do this? You know, you go around the streets at night, it's dangerous. You know, you pick up children, you know, that nobody wants. And why do you do that? You know, it's because in their eyes, I see Jesus, she would say. That's another way of saying that I see the image of God in people and I do everything I can to protect life. Right, so that's an introduction to you know, the Christian perspective on life. You know, whether at the beginning or the end, you know, life is important, and so we fight for life, and we do everything we can to protect life. And even in suffering, life is important. Even the suffering, God can, you know, can give us something through that. So that's my perspective. I know that there are, even tonight, there are several nurses here with us, and people that work with people in that are in difficult situations, and we want to be able to give you tools to be able to. This may be your belief in your life, that you believe in the importance of life, and you want to protect life, but what tools can I use in a situation where you know, where MAID is being presented? And so we want to kind of direct it in that way. You mentioned an ethical position, so this is kind of a religious position. What would be the ethical position that you could present or offer?
I think the notion that human life has great value is not only a religious position, it's always been there in all of our cultures, right? And that's what's being turned on its head now. And what's being put in its place is autonomy, right? So it's my body, I choose. And that's what's happening right now in our culture, and it's very, very ingrained. And if you ask anybody, like, why not? Or like, I don't think this is right, they'll say, yeah, well, what about my autonomy? We used to have sort of clear ethical principles that everybody accepted. One of them was you don't kill anybody, right? It's in the Ten Commandments. It's in the Beatitudes. It's everywhere, right? But that's the Christian perspective. But the Ten Commandments were not just an invention of the Judeo-Christian. It was the whole world that saw things that way. That taking someone's life is a grave affront to the gift of life that we've received. We're always shifting back and forth, right? But so the ethics of medicine was always very, very clear until a few decades ago. The ethics of all of the health professions were very, very clear. And now there's this deliberate effort to say, yes, but my autonomy comes first. And that's the biggest problem, I think.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
When we planned this evening, you know, we said for sure there should be a Christian ethos in behind this, and Pastor Paul did a great job, and there's so many other verses that can speak to this. But we also wanted to make sure that that we equip you as much as we can with what Dr. Ferrier said, is if you're talking to somebody who's not a Christian, who might be a different religion or might be an atheist, you can quote all the scripture you want, means nothing. And I think you need to have a logical way of speaking to them. Dr. Ferry alluded to this just now. I think the other thing I would bring up is and it's almost speaks to what Pastor Paul was saying, is how do we ascribe value to somebody, and if it's just what you can do for me or what you can do in society, ethically that doesn't make sense, right? Because then you know, you can get rid of, you know, most less than 15-year-old kids, you can get rid of many cognitively challenged people, you can get rid of many demented people, and guess what? That's where we're going. And so that's one issue I would have. And notice I didn't even bring up religion there. The other one, and maybe Dr. Ferrer is going to go ahead into this, but the other ethical argument I would have is the incredible slippery slope, right? And I think I just alluded to that. I mean, where do we stop? There's no stopping now, right? I spoke to one of the biggest international physicians, world renowned in palliative care and pediatrics. He works at the Montreal Children's Hospital. And I asked him the landscape of where things are at with MAID in pediatrics in Canada. And he says it's coming. And what's even worse, and he says he has nightmares about this. And I might get tears in my eyes, but babies, right? Why not? And notice the logical consistency of allowing late-term abortions. That's going to come over to a 5-day-old. The logic is going to be the same. Listen, I can abort my 30-week-or, then therefore I should be able to do away with my 5-day-old because I think that my 5-day-old, whatever, fill in the blank. And he says this thought keeps him up at night because he says it's coming. And so this is another ethical argument that there's the slippery slope is there. And where do we stop?
I think of people who have, for example, a disabled child, especially a cognitively disabled child, right? And who they look after them for years and years and years, and they're happy to do it because it's their child. And that's what we've always done as humanity, right? Not only Christians, but everybody. And our elders, when they lose their memory and they need help, we've always looked after them. And that's what's slipping away with this mentality that you don't, Pastor Paul was talking about dignity, right? So the idea that you can lose your dignity when you lose your ability to think clearly. And I've looked after lots of people who lose their ability to think clearly and lose their memory, and their dignity is always there, and but they could be treated in an undignified way, right? If they're in a place where the staff, they're hospital or a nursing home, the staff doesn't have time with them, and maybe neglects them or abuses them or whatever. They still have their dignity, but they're being treated in an undignified way. And that's one of the things that people are afraid of, right? That they can't defend themselves. But the idea about intrinsic dignity is really, really important. And another thing I think that's really important, and it's not a religious argument, is the idea that there's such a thing as an intrinsically evil act. And I read an article about that just the other day, and it had to do with the attack of Hamas on Israel, right? And I don't want to get into politics, but that you could murder people, innocent people, and women and babies, and rape women and all this kind of stuff, regardless of what political or ideological or suffering behind it. Those are intrinsically evil acts, and we've always learned, and that's what's being lost in this debate, is that it's intrinsically wrong to take another person's life, regardless of whether they ask you or they don't ask you. And if they ask you, generally it's a cry for help, and what you have to do is to address the things that are making them suffer, and chances are that request for death will go away. And it won't, not universally, and there's some people who have an ideological position that this is my freedom and I want to exercise my freedom, and we can't do a lot about those people. But most of the 13,000 people that died from MAID in 2022, they were people that we could have helped to not suffer. But the system was not set up to help them to not suffer, so they got their life ended by their doctor instead.
You mentioned that some people have maybe an ideological predisposition to wanting to end their lives. That exists even outside of the hospital. People that are well and have no... Dignity Canada. Yeah. I used to live on Papineau and St. Catherine, this area, right almost underneath the Jean-Cartier Bridge. And I remember when they first installed the fences, right? Because there were so many people jumping off the bridge. to kill themselves. And what is our response? No, no, we put up the fences, you know, so that to stop them from doing that, right? And isn't this the same? You know, what we try to do, put up the fences. No, no, you know, people can't want to. It can't be easy, you know, to end your life. And yeah. So the question that we'd like to kind of end with is how to communicate with medical system and family members when MAID is being proposed. And you had a few other slides, and maybe we can start going through that. And you good?
Yeah, could you put the slides back on, please? So this is, it's not just about MAID, but it's about, yeah, so the next one, navigating healthcare and making medical decisions. So this is a really quick overview of a very complex topic. And if anybody want to talk about it later, I'd be happy to. So the idea that in medicine, next slide, please. No medical intervention can be carried out without consent, right? That's one of the basics of medical ethics, is that you can't do something to somebody unless they consent. That they have to understand, they have to be free to make the consent, and so on and so forth. So, you know, one thing that I advise people is, if you're in the hospital, make sure you have somebody in your family to advocate for you. And if your family member is in the hospital, make sure that you're there for them. Because I see a lot of people who kind of go through a hospitalization and they have no clue what's going on because nobody tells them. And maybe the doctors think they told them, but they didn't understand. And so I think that this whole idea of being a full player in your healthcare is part of the solution to some of these things that are happening, because a lot of the push for MAID is because people have had bad experiences of serious illness and end of life. So, so don't be afraid to ask questions. Make sure everybody has an advocate. And everybody needs to reflect in advance, as Dr. Nemeth said a few minutes ago, about what they might choose if they were seriously ill and close to death. And there are two risks. One is that people get too much, right? They get CPR when there's cardiopulmonary resuscitation, when there's like zero chance of it being effective, and they just have this violent end instead of having a peaceful end. That's one extreme. Or they put in the ICU when there's no hope of the ICU helping them. But there's also people who get neglected because they're old or disabled, or the doctor doesn't want to bother. And those are the two extremes. Next, this is a blog that was in a medical journal a few years ago, written by a resident. And it basically describes her grandmother who went into the hospital. She'd been relatively well. She had a heart attack. She went into the hospital, and all of her organ systems started to fail, which is what happens sometimes because they were all just at the edge. And then the heart attack kind of triggered a whole lot of things happening. And the patient initially said, well, you know, I'm going to get better and go home, right? Because that's what everybody expects. And guess what? She didn't get better. And things started to go downhill. But after that first day when she said, yes, I want everything, like nobody talked to her about the fact that she might die. And so they just kept doing things to her. And this can happen in medical wards, especially with, you know, residents who don't have a lot of life experience and things like that, right? Things just happen. And then the patient dies one day. So this lady was being offered a colonoscopy and she died a few minutes, you know, a few hours later, because basically, like, nobody said, okay, let's step back, look at the full picture and the fact that things are going downhill. So maybe you might want to actually gather your family and talk to them and think about other things besides medical interventions, right? And this is a typical over treatment. Next one. So ageism and ableism in healthcare, so discrimination against older people and disabled people, happens all the time, right? So my geriatric patients, they go into the emergency room, and with all respect to emergency doctors, of course not Dr. Nemeth, but some other doctors will say, like, get this patient out of my emergency room, you know? And it's because they don't see the importance of looking after them because they're old and frail. So they might not be offered treatments that could be effective. They might not offer them resources that they want to use for somebody else. They might suggest medical aid in dying, which the law does not forbid. A doctor can suggest medical aid in dying, and I know people have had it suggested to them. Interpreting every desire for death, which could happen when you're feeling sick. Oh, you know, let's get this over with. So saying, oh yeah, they're asking for medical aid in dying. No, they're not. They're just saying that life is hard, right? But that can happen too. And then considering MAID for somebody who's not eligible because they don't understand or because they don't meet the criteria in the law, which are very, very, very broad. but there still are some criteria. So all of these things happen in our healthcare system. So next slide, please. So then the idea that it can be good sometimes to limit medical interventions. So that's what Dr. Nemeth mentioned before. So one phrase that I find useful is when the risks and the burdens are high and the likely benefit is low, you're weighing that and you might decide, okay, even if my lungs fail, I don't want to be on a ventilator because really it's not going to make me better. Even if my heart stops, the chance of restarting it are like less than 1%, so I'm not going to try it, and things like that. So you need the medical information, but you also need to know how everybody feels about things and what their worldview is and how they feel about being in the hospital versus home and all kinds of things. So these are things that need to be thought about ahead of time, especially as you get older and the risks go up and the benefits go down because your organ systems are failing. I don't know if I'm getting too complicated, but these. So this is not discrimination, right? This is good medicine to try to adjust the expectations to the condition of the person and involve the person in that kind of decision making so that they can say, okay, if I get pneumonia, you can give me antibiotics, you can even give me IV antibiotics, but don't put me in the ICU. That's a reasonable thing to say in certain circumstances. And the same for many, many, many other decisions. And this is not MAID. And one of the arguments by the MAID proponents is, there's already people dying because we withdraw care. So this is the same thing, but it's not the same thing, right? One is directly causing the death of a person, and the other is coming to terms with the fact that we cannot make anybody live forever, right? So this is not MAID, but people confuse it with MAID, I think sometimes deliberately, because it helps them to promote MAID. Next one. So this idea of advanced care planning is very, very important to think ahead. And there are websites and there are organizations that can help you to do this. And there's different ways of doing it. One is to name somebody in your family to speak for you if you can't speak for yourself, and to talk about that person, like, would I want to be in the ICU if there was almost no hope, or things like that, right? So name somebody in your family to speak for you. There are written documents that have some usefulness, but they also have some problems. They can often be ambiguous and the doctor doesn't understand what you meant when you wrote it. So that's a problem. But ongoing dialogue. So, in an ideal world, everybody has a family doctor who has lots of time for them and who's able to, kind of go through this discussion from time to time as the years go by. Not everybody has that, but the idea is that it's something that has to be ongoing. Next one. So for written advanced directives in Quebec, there are three kinds of documents that exist. One is a mandate. Maybe some of you have mandates. They're to delegate decision making if you lose ability to make decisions yourself. Part of it is about money. That's not relevant today. But part of it is to delegate somebody to make medical decisions for you. And that's a good thing to have. I would say everybody should have a mandate. Even if you never need to use it, you should have it. Then there's a form that we use in hospitals that I'll show you in a minute. That's called Levels of Intervention form. And then there's something that came into law in Quebec at the same time as the euthanasia law, the MAID law, which is a document that the Quebec government created that says, I never want CPR, I never want ventilators, I never want this. And there are only four things that you think about. But there are problems with that. And the biggest problem is that it's legally binding on the doctor. So even if they think they can save you with a certain intervention, if you sign this form saying you don't want it, they're not allowed to give it to you. So I find that a bit problematic. And it's much better to have somebody in your family that speaks for you if you have somebody. Next slide. There's also a problem with mandates that a lot of notaries, when they write mandates, I've seen this text many, many, many times in different mandates. And it basically says, if there's no hope, I don't want heroic measures. So like, what is no hope and what are heroic measures, right? And so that's a big, big problem, is that these people have this text in their mandates that they signed. It's a legal document. And it says things that are so vague and so ambiguous that they could be interpreted to mean almost anything. And I think that that's a big, big problem. This is the form that we use in hospitals that I think is useful, but we have to know how to use it well. So it's called the Levels of Intervention form. It doesn't replace consent. It doesn't replace a good conversation. And it's completed by the doctor, but in discussion with the patient and probably usually the patient's family. And this is the core part that has 4 levels of care. So say you're 25 years old and in perfect health. Well, then, if you have a car accident and you land in the hospital, you want to do everything, right? If you're maybe getting older and you would say, well, the ICU would be too much for me, then there's level B that would be, yes, try to prolong life, but with some limitations. And then either the patient, if they're conscious, or somebody else can, in discussion with the doctor, decide what those limitations would be. So that is, and then C would mean somebody's getting close to the end of life. So then you're putting more emphasis on keeping them comfortable and peaceful and without pain than on prolonging their life, because you see that that's not really realistic anymore. And then there's D, which means you don't think about prolonging life at all because the end of life is very close and you're really focusing on making them comfortable. So you might not even, stick a needle into them because it bothers them and things like that. So this is a useful tool, but always in the context of conversation with the patient, with the family. At the bottom, it says attempt CPR or do not attempt CPR. And the wording is important because older versions just said CPR or no CPR. And that we didn't tell people that even if you try it, most of the time you fail. And that's a really important thing to know, because if you watch TV shows about medicine, everybody gets up and goes to work, after having their heart started again. And so it's really important to know that, especially as you get older and you develop chronic illnesses, CPR is very unlikely to be effective. So it's try it versus don't try it. And again, if you're 25, for sure you would try it, right? Unless there's some reason not to. But as you get older and you accumulate illnesses, then it becomes less and less realistic, and it's a very violent procedure, as was said. So just to summarize that, so everybody has to consent to what's done to them in the hospital. We can limit treatments or interventions when the risks and the burdens are high and the benefits are low. As you go through, and you've probably seen this, as you go through an illness, like the way you see things changes, right? So you get diagnosed with your cancer and you say, oh my God, I got to do everything to save myself. And then, you've been through 2 rounds of chemotherapy and you think, and you're offered another one that they don't expect it to be very helpful. And you've already come to terms with the fact that you're sick and that your death might be closer. And you're able to think on a different level than you were able to think the first day you got your diagnosis. And the same thing with many illnesses. But it's important to reflect in advance, to name somebody, and to use documents, but use them carefully, and they're never a substitute for informed consent. So I think that's all I have to say in a structured manner, but I'm sure we have lots of things that we can keep on saying.
Yeah, so questions come and go, but
as I was looking around the crowd, about 15% of you are under 40. And you're probably saying why am I listening to this? Well, a couple of things. Number one, nobody knows, right? And I want to think more a bit, but my family knows I come home with horror stories almost every day of 20s, 30s, 40s, right? Having terminal cancer. So number one. Number two is, it's important for the young people to listen, because you have parents and grandmothers, grandparents, and uncles and aunts. And I think it's good for you to be informed about the decisions that you might need to make. And you should have a discussion with your parents or with your grandparents about, because it's good to be prepared, like Dr. Ferrier was saying.
right. So it is 10 after 8, and I know we talked about whether or not to have questions, and just because it worried us a little bit what kind of questions would come up in a situation like this, but I'm open to questions. It sounds like your colleague has a question. Yeah, so we just can't hear you properly. Can you stand up? Can you stand? There you go.
Hi, everybody. I'm retired nurse, and now I'm volunteering in cancer center. And I have this question, and a lot of my friends all ask the same question, that when we have made the aid it's one injection and you go slowly. When you're in palliative care, they give you morphine or similar to that, slowly to make you comfortable, and you go dying. So what is the difference between this?
Morphine doesn't kill anybody if it's used properly. That's the answer to that question. It does not kill anybody. No. Okay, so morphine is used for pain and it works. And if you give people like 10 times or 100 times more morphine than they need, then they might die. But if you give them the amount of morphine that they need, they will not die. It's also used for respiratory distress and it works, but it doesn't stop you from breathing. Do you agree?
Completely agree.
One of my francophone colleagues told me once that in French milieus, people say, "Oh, morphine, la mort," and they think that that's where the word came from, but it actually comes from Morpheus, which is sleep. And so they often use the brand name in French because so people don't think. But morphine does not kill you, and that's one of the myths that makes people think, "Oh yeah, we're doing it already, just slowly through palliative care," but it's not the same thing.
I've heard this as well, and I have occasion to be around people who go through this process too often, right? And morphine often is part of the conversation. That the more morphine someone gets, the harder it is to breathe, or there's liquid in their lungs. And what is that about? Here, let's.
I'm sure Dr. Ferry can answer this question too, but I'm giving her a chance to drink a bit. So, how much time do you have? So, I know, I'm joking. So morphine acts in the brain to decrease the drive to breathe. So we breathe maybe 16, 18 times a minute. If you give too much morphine, that 16, 18 comes down to 10. So it actually doesn't prevent breathing, it just decreases the respiratory rate. But like Dr. Ferry said, just like every medicine could be a poison and a cure, same thing with morphine. If you adjust the dosage appropriately, it actually, like Dr. Ferry said, not only help with pain, but it actually decreases that distress, that's horrible distress that I'm drowning or that I can't breathe. So it's an incredibly important strategy when you're trying to palliate somebody.
There are actually studies that show that palliative care can prolong life. So good pain control can prolong life because all of your stress hormones go down. And you can, I'm not talking about years, I'm talking about days, right? So these are people who are close to death. You give them good pain control, and some of them will live longer, not less. And that's really important that everybody understand.
Tell us something about what it takes for someone to change their decision. For instance, if at first, I want to die, and then their mind changes to, oh no, I guess I can live, or to change a mindset. What does it take for someone to change a mindset?
I'm going to give you the emerged perspective. So death, death is an incredible motivator to live. That's the best way to put it. Dr. Ferry showed us those level of intervention where, somebody says, you know what, I have cancer, end-stage cancer, I want to be a level C, I don't want to be resuscitated. This happens all the time. And they come into the emergency department because they have water in their lungs from cancer or from what have you. They're very sick. And I asked them, listen, you signed this form 2 months ago that you don't want to have the tube into your throat, you don't want to put on a ventilator. They changed their minds. So, and everybody wants to live. And so the very simple answer to your question, Pastor, is death is a great motivator.
If I could add something, in palliative care, people who are approaching death, they often express a desire for death because they're afraid, right? Or because they're in distress. And I had an experience recently with someone who was saying that, like, help me to die. And the doctor started looking at all of the different things that were causing his distress. Okay, one was that he was afraid of morphine, and so he wasn't getting any. And so they sat down and went through all of the fears and resolved all of the fears, and he started getting morphine. Many other things. He couldn't get out of bed, so they actually started putting him with a lift into a chair so he could go out of his room and go to other places in the hospital and have a more interesting life than just in his hospital room. So all of the little things that can contribute to someone's distress, all of those are important. And that's what a good palliative care service will address one by one. And guess what? Then the requests for death start going down, partly because they feel loved and paid attention to, and partly because their fears are addressed and their little discomforts are addressed.
You have a question? Do you want to say it in the mic?
Someone less than 30.
Wait, are you less than 30?
I won't correct you on that one. We've been kind of discussing this in preparation of this evening, and quality of life being a big one, right? A big issue and factor for people wanting to end their life early. What would you mentioned just now multiple kind of aspects of what that means, what that looks like. But if you could choose one, you mentioned poverty, you mentioned palliative care, right? End of life. Like if there was kind of one, if we could all kind of, focus attention or something like that, which one would you say that is social issues or in the medical hospitals, end of life care? There was one in particular that kind of, as far as that diminishes quality of life.
Loneliness. Yeah, I think that's the big one. If somebody, regardless of how sick you are, if you have people around you who love you and who are interested in your welfare and who are willing to put themselves out for you, I think that's probably the biggest driver. Is people in our society are often very isolated and afraid, and they have nobody to turn to. Right.
Our society is lonely. And that's more important than being sick, right? It's important.
I have a question, Pastor Paul.
I'm a social worker, and I work in disabilities in the healthcare system. Triple lucky me. And I guess my question to you is it possible for our system to be reorganized in such a way that that sense of caring, that, isolated rooms? I live in Verdun, and they just expanded the hospital there to individual rooms. So it's more individual care again. And I'm just wondering, because my job is fighting with the healthcare system, trying to get resources for people who have disabilities. And is it possible in Quebec?
So Catherine looks to me for the so that I answered the tough questions. No. I'm my wife, my kids will tell me I'm usually I am optimistic, but just because I say no doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, right? I'm not saying it can't happen, but I can't see our current reality, how things are and how people are cared for changing in the next 10 years. I don't know if Dr. Ferry has a different point of view, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to continue trying to fight for it. That's my answer to it. And maybe Dr. Ferry has something else, but I also want to say, incredible work you do. I don't know you, but I know social workers are like angels. They're incredible work you guys do, and God bless you.
I think I agree with the no. Like, one problem now, and I think it's particularly acute in our province, is that we think that the state has to solve all our problems, right? And like, one reason that we think the state has to solve all our problems is because a lot of people don't have strong families, or they're alone, or their kids moved away to another province. So I think, yes, we have to make the state health and social service system work as well as it can for people, but we also have to empower families to look after their own. And I had a patient once who was looking after her husband, and she used to say, I'm doing the system a favor because I'm looking after my husband, and I could just, call 911 and say, take him away, and I'm not taking him back. And it's true, in a sense, she could have, right? But that's not like the attitude, I mean, either as Christians or as humans that we want to have, right? Like, it's normal that we look after each other. We look after each other in families, in communities, in neighborhoods, in churches, in all of the parts, the groups that we're part of. And sometimes a lot of the things that the healthcare system does is because people have no natural connections to look after them in that way. And we certainly do need the health and social service system. But, if a disabled person, even this guy who was trying to get the home directed, to get his own home care, like he was like alone in the world, right? If he'd had, siblings or other family members that could pitch in and help out, or maybe give him some money, maybe things would have been a little bit different. But the idea that the state has to do everything for us, I think, is a bit of a poison. And yes, we need help. And I think, I think our healthcare system, I wouldn't want to live in the U.S., but it's good that we have healthcare available to everybody. But of course, the needs are endless, right? And so we'll never meet all the needs. And that's not what the state should be for. It should be backing up. Like, when the natural supports are not enough, that's when the state should step in a sense, especially from a social point of view.
But the state can't solve loneliness. Morphine can't solve loneliness. So it's just an interesting way that this discussion has has ended in this. Maybe, sorry.
Maybe just ask online because the volume wasn't up. No?
Yeah. Is there anybody here that has? We have 5 more minutes. One more question, Sandy.
I'm under 30.
Sandy is not under 30, but go ahead. I'm sorry. Did you want to speak? Just so that the online people.
Thank you. Okay, a few years ago, a local hospital here, they amputated the wrong leg off the gentleman. And ever since I heard that, I thought that's a big whoops. But now I go to the hospital, I'm actually afraid to go to the hospital. I'm afraid because I have to ask now, what's in that? What is it for? Why do I need it? What are the side effects? I feel like I have to be almost a researcher just for my own case. I also am concerned that since I'm in that over 30 group, that I probably would be the next target because seniors would save the system a lot of money. I mean, that's when we're getting to little problems here and there and, and nuisance cases sometimes. And so I'm thinking that, yeah, we're probably the next in line. That would save the, we could all be like, and you say that it's something we sign that we don't have to, but it reminds me of the mask mandate. We don't have to take the COVID. We don't have to put anything in our bodies. And which side of the coin you were on that, the fact is the government pretty much made you or you would have to lose your job in this. So the fact that I don't have to do MAID, I'm leery of all that.
I think your wonderful husband of 40 years of age will have something to say about that, right?
Good. I don't know. Maybe there's several nurses here that are present. Maybe you have a question, comment. Yeah, come. No, you have to come. You have to come. You have to come. Okay, I'll repeat your question. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm an emergency nurse, so I see a lot of those people nowadays. And one of them is we talk about quality of life, right? The problem is, what about like I have a case, and like it was this woman. She was young. She was in like the 50s, and she had she was paralyzed after an operation, and basically she couldn't breathe, she couldn't eat, she was completely like you can't talk, there's no eye contact, nothing at all, like completely we're keeping her alive basically, right? And like Christian point of view, yes, like it's important, it's a gift from God, but how to address that? I find it's very hard in situations like that because you don't want to be for that medical assistance, but at the same time, you see the person, you can't even see if they're in pain because, there's no expression on their face. There's nothing, absolutely nothing. She can't turn in bed. She can't do nothing for herself. So it's very hard.
Are you going to repeat the question?
Repeat the question and the answer.
So the question was about somebody who is very disabled after an illness. Is that right?
Not
Well, it's more like, let's say, after surgery. Because
After
she had an
surgery?
illness, there was
Okay.
surgery that brought her to this kind
So
of.
it was a bad outcome of surgery that led to her being unconscious and paralyzed. Is she on a ventilator?
She was not, was she? That was quite a while ago. She was, yeah, she had a tracheo.
She had a trach and a ventilator.
Yeah, she
Wow.
had a tracheo. So,
Yeah.
I mean, like she had like a tracheo. We were giving her food
My tube.
line, like like everything was done like by us.
Yeah.
There was absolutely no way of communicating with her. It was extremely hard, and she was constantly in the hospital. She had like she would stay like let's say in like a residence because they do have residence for people like that. But I mean, she would constantly get like infections, so she would constantly be back in the hospital, in and out.
So, I mean, there are many issues here. So this is somebody who is basically totally disabled, right? And who is having recurrent acute illnesses because of their disability. And so we were saying before, like, you don't have to do everything to prolong her life all the time, right? So risks versus burdens. If she has a serious infection, are you going to treat it? Is the ventilator extraordinary treatment that could be withdrawn because it's too much for her? So we're never going to say her life has no value because she can't do anything or can't think or can't. We don't know what she can think, right? Because she can't express. We're never going to say that, and we should never say that. But we can say, like, what are we doing to this person, right? So, I see people with dementia, for example, you bring them to the emergency room, and it's such a terrible experience for them that they would have been better to stay home, even if they didn't get all of the modern treatments. And maybe they would have died because you didn't bring them to the emergency room. So we should never stop looking after people, but we don't necessarily have to do all of the technical interventions that are available to us when it's too much for the person, and often it becomes too much for the person. So that's where it becomes, you have to reflect a lot and get a lot of information and involve the patient and their family if they have a family. But sometimes there are people who are like that, and it turns out that they have locked-in syndrome or something, and whatever. But there was a guy in France who wrote a book called the Diving Bell and the Butterfly. Did you ever hear this guy? So he had a stroke, and I think it was a stroke, and he had locked-in syndrome, which means that his mind was perfectly normal, but he had no way of expressing himself. And the problem is, you think that they're unconscious, but they're conscious. And anyway, so he ended up writing a book. Very interesting guy. I forget his name, but if you Google The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, the original was in French, Le Scaphandre et le Papillon. So anyway, but it's not that we have to do everything for somebody like that. But neither can we say, oh, they're garbage,
We certainly don't say that unborn babies are garbage, right? And they're completely dependent on the mother. So whether it's the beginning of life, or like we said before, the beginning of life or the end of life, we value life because people are created in the image of God. And that image is resident in a person no matter what they're able to do or not able to do, right? And that was the point that I was making from the Christian perspective, right? I think we'll end it there tonight. There's two things I wanted to do. First, I wanted to thank you for coming, making this a success, and I think that we will want to do something similar, maybe a follow-up to what we did tonight. Secondly, I wanted to thank our guests, And yeah.